Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and today we're going to talk about the upsides and the downsides of tourism. We've talked about that it is a good thing, but we want to recognize that there can be some trade-offs. Let's remind ourselves of some of the things we've talked about earlier. For example, tourism is a huge global industry. It's bigger than the energy, manufacturing, and agricultural industries. So we're talking about something that has the potential to have a huge impact on the global economy, which means tourism is the world's leading economic contributor. It contributes more than energy does, more than manufacturing does, more than agricultural. So as the largest industry in the world, you can imagine that it's going to have the possibilities that are really truly endless. It's also something that has a growing impact. Although during COVID, we know that tourism took a really big hit. We know that from our own experiences here. Anyone who wanted to go places may not have been able to. And of course, we know that all kinds of jobs were cut during COVID as countries closed their borders. We've looked at some data. On the left, we see actual data. Of course, you see before 2019 and then just after COVID. But before COVID started, we had a sector that was more than 10.4% of the global gross domestic product. So if we add up all countries' GDP, we get the global GDP, and that's 10.4% of it is tourism. Of course, it fell during COVID, bouncing back in year 2022, but on the right you see forecasts, and those forecasts suggest it's going to bounce back and it's going to continue to grow. By 2033, they're expecting 11.6% in terms of what tourism contributes to the global economy. Of course, tourism, we also mean travel. So if I'm traveling for business, that may not be tourism, but that would be included in this data. Tourism creates lots of job opportunities for people. Remember that tourism is part of the service sector, and in a lot of economies, the service sector is what's growing. We know the service sector is also something that's very labor intensive, right? Compared to maybe some other things. It might be more labor intensive than, let's say, manufacturing. We have to think about all the travel agents, the guides, hotel workers, restaurant staff. You can imagine all of the different jobs that get created with tourism. And the interesting thing is that these are ranging from professional jobs, like your travel agents and your guides are professionals. In most countries, guides have to be educated, they have to be licensed, and they range to the unskilled. You don't have to be a skilled worker to work in a hotel in a lot of jobs. Maybe you're working in housekeeping, maybe you're working on the grounds crew. Of course, same thing in restaurants, in the kitchen, waiting tables. So tourism creates job opportunities. Not all of them are going to be super high income jobs, but they might be better than opportunities that people have otherwise. And they range from professional to unskilled jobs. So it creates opportunities across the different economic classes, and that's one great thing that tourism does. One place that we do see big benefits is for women. A lot of these jobs are going to be directed at women. Women tend to be more in the service sector, travel agents. A lot of my guides have been women. You see a lot of hotel staff and restaurant workers that are women. So this creates opportunities for women, and think about what that means. That gives women an opportunity to enter the workforce. It also might mean that households can have two incomes instead of one. This data right here shows you the number of travel and tourism jobs worldwide. Again, we're looking at 2019, 2020, we see the dip starts to rebound, 2021, rebounds even more, 2022. So again, you see the effect of COVID, but even before COVID, we had 334 millions of jobs, because remember it says these are measured in millions. But let's look at the forecasts on the right. It's going to rebound, and so this data is a little bit old as I record this, but we've seen a bounce back, and by 2033, they're expecting this to be 430 million jobs. That is a lot of employment. Tourism also involves a lot of spending. We have to think about all the different categories. It could involve transportation. We're taking airplanes, we're taking trains, we're taking buses, we're using taxis. When you get somewhere, you've got housing. It could be Airbnb, but it could be hotels and hostels, dining out. Then you've got activities and guide services. You're buying art, you're buying souvenirs. There's so many different ways that we're spending our money. And then, of course, on top of all of that, we're providing tips to people. All of this money creates quite a lot of economic impact. If we look at data on total travel and tourism spending, again, we're looking just before COVID and just after COVID to give you an idea. In 2019, you're talking about $6.41 trillion. Now, big decrease in 2020 you see during COVID. Think about all the impact that would have had, the negative impact it would have had on economies, on a lot of people, a lot of communities. But we see bouncing back, 21, it goes up again, 2022. When we continue to follow this data, we're going to see this rebounding. But the idea is this is trillions of dollars, more than $6 trillion before COVID hit. This graph goes back even further, back to 1990, it looks like 95 or so, maybe a little bit before. This is international tourism expenditures coming from the World Bank, and you just see that number going up and up and up. Remember, we've got a couple dips. You see that dip right there around 2008. So that's the global financial crisis, right? The Great Recession. Then you see another dip later. We've got other economic downturns going on, but then we'd have COVID, which doesn't show up here because the data ends at 2018. Often we see what economists call price discrimination when we think about tourism. This is an economic form of discrimination. We're not talking about on the basis of race or religion or gender. So understand that we're not talking about the traditional types of discrimination that we might otherwise see. This is an economic form of discrimination. And the idea is that tourists have more income, right? It's not surprising to think that those people who are able to go on trips are ones that have disposable income, right? So they have more income. And think about it, when you're on vacation, you come prepared to spend a lot of money. You know it's going to cost you. Maybe you've been saving, but you are there to spend and you're there to do things. In other words, you're not going to be skimping out on activities when you travel. So generally, tourists tend to be less price sensitive. That's really where we're going with this, that we're focusing on the idea that tourists are less price sensitive, both because they have more money, but also because it's your chance of a lifetime. You're in Bolivia, you're in Thailand, you're in Egypt. You need to do those things. In other words, in economics, we would say these people have a more inelastic demand as opposed to an elastic demand. Other examples of things we talk about with inelastic demand, just for those of you who haven't had much economics, think about gasoline. We don't have a lot of substitutes for gasoline. So if they raise the price of gasoline, I might try to cut back a little bit. I'm going to make fewer unnecessary shopping trips to Richmond. But generally, I'm going to be fairly price insensitive when it comes to gasoline. I'm going to have a relatively inelastic demand. Well, that's what we mean by price discrimination. And on this basis, we might see tourists have higher prices than others. In fact, we often see tourist and non-tourist prices advertised because, again, we're kind of sticking it to the tourists, knowing that they come ready to spend. They are less price sensitive. So here's one of my favorite places that I take my students to in Thailand. This is beautiful Erawan waterfall, part of my Thailand study abroad. And if you're a local, you can enter this facility for 100 baht. That's about equivalent to $3. But if you're a tourist, you're going to pay 300 baht, which is $9. Now, guys, $9 to enter this beautiful park, which has 6 or 7 different waterfalls. It's an incredible value. But notice that tourists are paying 3 times the amount. Why are they paying 3 times the amount? Because these places can get it from the tourists. Tourists are willing to pay this because they are less price sensitive. And if tourists are going to pay, you're going to charge. It's a strategy to increase revenue. So parks, other types of admission fees are going to be based on this principle. It's a way to increase revenue, and that's good if you're trying to make a living from this. Now, you might say, okay, but Erawan Waterfall is a national park, and you might argue that Thais pay taxes. And because they pay taxes, they're already supporting these national parks. And I would not disagree with you, but here's the thing. Private facilities do exactly the same thing. We don't see the two different prices simply because this is a national park and Thai people already pay their taxes. Private facilities are going to use this strategy as well. Here's another example. I found a study that collected some of these examples in Venice. So Venice, Italy, that's a hot tourist destination, right? So this study reports that if you want to go on a water taxi, remember Venice has all those beautiful canals, it's €7 for tourists, but it's €1.30 for locals. If you want to enter the palace, €18 for tourists, but it's free for locals. Public Wi-Fi. If you want a 24-hour pass, tourists, €5, free for locals. You want to use a public restroom. And by the way, if you've never traveled much, there are places where you pay to use the restroom. That is just a fact of life. Tourists have to pay €1.50, whereas locals only have to pay €0.25, right? 25 euro cents. So you see what's happening here. They're taking advantage of the fact that tourists are going to spend. And then finally, we see this a lot with transportation. If you're in Venice and you want a transportation card, €50 for tourists, the same pass, €10 for locals. Tourism is also the leading producer of tax revenue, and we often see special taxes directed at tourists, and these are going to be taxes that are different than what locals are going to pay. One thing about taxes, when you impose them on tourists in this manner, they're easy to collect. So we have a lot of tourists paying these special taxes. It's not administratively costly to collect. We're going to bring in a lot of money. But it's also a way to export taxes. So what do I mean by export taxes? I mean to put the burden on people other than your own citizens. Let me give you some examples, though, for international travel. There are entry and exit taxes at immigration. Sometimes you pay to enter, sometimes you pay to exit. And by the way, Costa Rica has a $29 exit tax. Now, we're not necessarily going to pay that directly. It's already been built into our airline ticket. But in the past, we used to have to stand in a line and pay this exit tax at the airport before we could go through immigration. Add to that larger taxes at hotels, and these are taxes that are higher than just sales taxes. So your hotel tax rate would be pretty large. Well, think about it. Are locals staying in the hotels? No, it's the foreigners, the visitors that are staying in the hotels. So this is an export strategy, and we do this in Farmville too. If you look at our tax rate on hotels, it's going to be higher than just the sales tax rate because it's a way of getting money from people not from Farmville. So we've exported our tax. There's also tourist taxes, and these are usually collected by hotels, so it might seem like it's a hotel tax, but it's actually a separate tax. So I was in Portugal recently, and for every night you were there, you had to pay something like a couple euros in tourist tax, and the hotel is responsible for collecting it and remitting it to the government. There are also prepared meals taxes. Prepared meals taxes are taxes that are a higher tax rate, and they're imposed on food at restaurants. We have a prepared meals tax here in Farmville. Now, of course, that does mean when locals go out to eat, they're going to pay more. But think about how effective this could be in a highly touristic area where you have mainly tourists eating. This is going to bring in a lot of money. We also know that tourism can have a huge impact on the developing world. We've already mentioned that there are benefits to women. A lot of these jobs are going to be held by women, and there are additional benefits when women enter the labor force. Remember, household incomes are increasing. Maybe a family has gone from a single income family to a dual income family, and that can be a good thing. But also when women enter the labor force, we see that birth rates decline. When birth rates decline, that's going to play an important role in population growth. So when women are entering the labor force, we see a connection there with decreasing population growth. It can also reduce age at first marriage. There are women now going into the workforce instead of immediately getting married and starting to have children. We also know that tourism creates alternate sources of income, and those alternate sources of income might replace some of the destructive activities. Now, I don't want to overemphasize this too much, but you can imagine that maybe we see a little less logging that's illegal when we have other alternatives that can bring in a good living, like being involved in tourism. It could also displace some of the activities with a less favorable orientation, like the sex industry, which is alive and kicking in places like Thailand, and it's very visible. Maybe some people who don't have many options and they would find themselves in the sex industry could find themselves in the tourist industry instead. And of course, we know that tourism helps address sustainable development goals, especially when we see tourism expanding in the developing world. We know that tourism can help propel economic growth, and we've seen that with Costa Rica, how ecotourism has really helped propel their economic growth and opens up opportunities. Let's take another quick look at our sustainable development goals, and you'll see that we could link it to number 1, no poverty. We can link it to number 5, gender equality, because now we have more opportunities for women. We can link it to number 8, decent work and economic growth, because the jobs that come from tourism might be replacing less desirable jobs. And we know tourism leads to economic growth. 10, we might say that tourism increases opportunities. It might reduce inequalities. There are so many different ways we could say that tourism is promoting the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, we've just said that developing nations are benefiting when tourism expands. And here's some data. It's a little bit old, but I love this, and I've not been able to replicate it by being able to update it. But it says that in 1950, the top 15 tourist destinations got 88% of all arrivals. In 1950, we could probably predict what some of these destinations were. United States, Canada, Germany, France, we could probably figure out most of these. But by 2010, those top 15 tourist destinations only got 55% of all the arrival. What's the reason? Because we're traveling to so many new places. So in just a 60-year period, we've started seeing a whole lot of other places in the globe starting to attract tourism, build their tourism industry, and benefit from it. And of course, a lot of these new places that we're traveling to, they are developing nations. In 1990, 32% of tourist arrivals were in the emerging and developing nations. That's incredible. By 1990, 1/3 just about of tourist arrivals were in the developing world. We are out there exploring the developing world. That's amazing. But by 2010, this has increased to 47%. Personally, my preference is to be in the developing world. I think it's more interesting. I learn more. I think there's more real immersive experiences. Doesn't mean I don't go to Spain and Portugal and Germany and those kinds of places, but my heart is with travel in the developing world. And I think you'll see why when we're there. Let's revisit something we've talked about before, and that's the creation of economic impact. I want to remind you that when we have a direct effect from a tourist, and remember, direct effect is that tourist paying for something, paying for a piece of art or paying for a hotel reservation, going out to eat. That direct effect is the tourist literally paying for something, but that creates indirect and induced effects. And if we add the direct effect and the indirect effect and the induced effect, we get the total economic impact, and it can be quite large. Now let's review very quickly indirect and induced effects. Remember that the indirect effect is the increase in business to business activity. And that might be like buying from suppliers. So a tourist eats at a restaurant. If that restaurant is very popular with tourists, well, now that owner of the restaurant needs to order more supplies. It might be more food products. It might be more aprons for the staff. It might be more tablecloths. You get the idea. There's more business activity taking place between different businesses as they meet the needs of tourists. But then we have the induced effect. We call these the household effect. And that is all of these workers now have more money in their pocket. When you have more money in your pocket, your spending goes up. So when they go out and spend this money that they didn't previously have, that money starts to circulate around. That creates an additional economic effect. So direct plus indirect plus induced gives us our total economic impact. We also remember the multiplier effect, and economists point to the multiplier effect because this is important. We know that money circulates through the economy. That means that each dollar that's brought by a tourist actually creates more than $1 of economic activity because of this multiplier effect. Let's look at an example. Let's say a tourist arrives and eats at a local restaurant. That restaurant owner has more money. They use the money to buy fresh produce at the local market. So that's more of a business to business type of effect, right? So we might call that our indirect effect. But money continues to circulate because now the farmer who sold the groceries to the restaurant, they've got more money in their pocket and they're going to purchase meat for their family to consume. That sounds more like a household effect, right? An induced effect. But now the local butcher who just sold the farmer some meat, he's going to use his earnings to buy fabric for his wife because she wants to sew a new dress. We have lots of different effects taking place here. But the point is that the impact of a $20 expenditure, that direct effect right there, the tourist arriving and eating at a local restaurant, let's say he spends $20, well, that creates more than a $20 impact on the economy. And that's the multiplier effect. And that's why tourism is really important, because it can create this multiplicative effect. Of course, we've talked about before that it depends on the level of leakage, right? And so if there's a lot of leakage, we know that this economic effect is going to be smaller. But when you can limit the leakage, well, that's going to create the biggest economic effects. Let's talk more about this idea of leakage. Let's say that we have a tourist and they're eating at an American chain like Fridays. And you might be thinking, where in the world would there be a Fridays? Well, I kid you not, I'm in Athens, Greece. Walk by, there is a TGI Fridays right there. I generally don't see a whole lot of Fridays as I travel, but there was indeed one there. So let's say this tourist is eating at Fridays, an American chain. We know that some of the restaurant profits are going to go to local employees, right? Think about waiters who live in the community, and you've got managers and busboys and people who are responsible for doing repairs. So we don't want to suggest that all of the money is leaking out, but what we do want to suggest is that some of the profits are going to get exported, and they're going to get exported to the United States if we're talking about an American chain. That's going to reduce the amount of economic impact. Again, leakage decreases the multiplication effect. So why exactly do we see leakage? Well, we've given some obvious examples, but let's talk about this in a little more depth. Development often involves foreign corporations, and not just foreign corporations, but maybe international donors. So when an entity wants to develop or construct something or do some kind of major project, maybe they have to bring in foreign companies. Why might that be? Well, especially if we're talking about developing nations, they may not have the necessary resources or even the know-how required to undertake a big project. And that's going to be especially true when we're talking about large infrastructure projects. Maybe you need to expand your airport. That might be something you decide to contract out to a foreign firm. That might not be something that you do in-house. It just depends. When you have foreign corporations involved and international donors, that does mean that some profits do not stay in the country. That's going to create some of the leakage we just talked about. So just like when you eat at TGI Fridays, it creates leakage. Well, when a developing country contracts with a foreign corporation for a big infrastructure project, that's going to have a similar kind of effect. That means that some of the money is going to flow home to where the investments came from. To limit this, sometimes thinking small is better. Small scale construction might be better. That may not help you if your goal is to build a new airport, right? You don't want to do that small scale, obviously. But If there are projects where the scale can be reduced, then maybe that can be done with less outside involvement. So sometimes smaller can be better. And if you don't need the outside involvement, you can hire local people, hire local contractors. That means more money stays inside the country. And that's the goal, right? To reduce the leakage, which increases economic impact. Government expenditures can create economic impact as well. So it's not just private expenditures like people building resorts. It can also be activities undertaken by government. They are going to also have a multiplier effect that's important. But again, sometimes they're going to contract out with foreign companies. It's not always something that can be done in-house or be done by locals. If you are contracting out to foreign companies, then some of the funds again are going to be exported out of the country, creating this leakage. As an example, let's talk about something in Ecuador, and that is the building of the pipeline for oil in the Amazon jungle. So they're drilling for oil in the Amazon jungle, which is a problem in and of itself that we're not going to talk about right now, but to get the oil out of the Amazon, they built pipelines. And when you're driving into the Amazon for a couple hours at least, you see this pipeline going the entire way. Well, the Ecuadorian government hired a Chinese company. Chinese company is doing this work. And that means that they're not supporting local businesses, that there were jobs created, but some of the profits that go to the contractor are going to flow back to China. That's going to be leakage. In addition, the tubing materials were imported from China. Anytime you rely on an import instead of buying locally, that's going to be leakage as well. Lots of jobs were created, but the contractor brought much of their own labor force. Now, if the Chinese people are there long term, which they were, they're living there, then there is still going to be an induced effect, right? They have money in their pocket and it's still going to circulate around the economy. But what if they're sending half of their earnings back to China? Well, that will be leakage as well because not as much money is going to circulate. So you can see from this example that there's lots of opportunities when you contract out with a foreign company that money is going to be leaving the economy. We also know that tourism expenditures spent on imports, they are going to create leakage. This could be a direct expenditure. For example, maybe a tourist buys art and they're thinking it's Costa Rican, but it turns out it's really made in China or Guatemala or some other Central American country. Well, that's going to support other countries, right? Guatemalan artists benefit, but this isn't money that stays in Costa Rica. So this would be an example of leakage. But it also could be leakage from an indirect expenditure related to an import. And this could involve supply chains that include foreign entities. So supply chains, right? We're talking about suppliers of the inputs to production. For example, the souvenir shop imports items from Africa. So instead of selling only locally produced items, they're selling stuff from Africa. So when they buy African art, that would be that indirect expenditure because that's a business to business expenditure, and they're stocking the shelves with African art items. Or it could be something like hotels that buy Chinese-made bedding. Now, when I buy bedding, I'm usually not paying attention to where it's made, and that's a bad thing, right? Because I'm creating leakage. But if you're a hotel buying 200 comforters that you're shipping in from a producer who's contracted with a company in China to make them there, well, that's more leakage. The bottom line is that your choices do matter, and we've talked about this before. Spend your dollars in a way that make the biggest impact. Dining at locally owned restaurants and staying in locally owned hotels. Buy the locally produced souvenirs. Make sure it's actually produced in the country where you're touring. And consuming the local products when you can. So have that local beer as opposed to that imported beer. A great example comes from cruise tourism, and I think this is a good illustration. Think about going on a cruise, and I am not criticizing you if you love cruises. I'm just pointing out the difference. Think about going on a cruise. Maybe you're taking a boat from Florida. The boat usually originates from a U.S. destination when we're talking about tours that we go on. So a boat shows up in Florida, we get on it in Florida. It's organized by a U.S. company. You're sleeping on the ship, so you're not creating hotel reservations in other countries. You're dining on the ship, maybe not every meal, but the bulk of your meals. So you're spending only limited amounts on food in other countries. And much of the supplies are being brought from the origin country. So when the boat leaves from Florida, they have stocked up on supplies from vendors in the United States. Often the employees are not from the destination countries. So if it's an American company, then most of their employees might be Americans. That's not universally true, but you get the idea. And then when you do go to a foreign destination, maybe you go to the Bahamas, it's a limited stay. You're going for the day. Doesn't mean you can't have some economic impact. You can go buy some souvenirs and go have a margarita somewhere, but your stay is going to be limited. It's creating a lot less impact than if you actually just went to those countries. Tourism is important to the global economy. We've already established that. And it's important enough to the global economy that the United Nations is involved in global tourism. There's an organization called the United Nations World Tourism Organization. I'm not going to expect you to memorize that, but they promote responsible, sustainable, and universally accessible tourism. And they're promoting the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's move on to talk about other benefits of tourism. I know I've convinced you at this point that tourists create a lot of jobs for others, they spend a lot of money, they pay a lot of taxes, there's a lot of financial benefits that come from tourism. But we also want to remember that when money circulates through a community, they're able to better diversify. In other words, they're going to get involved in a bigger set of activities because skills are transferable. Those people that are involved in tourism, for example, can bring their skills to other activities. And that helps insulate communities from external shocks. So what am I talking about by external shocks? Well, we've seen a good one, right? The COVID pandemic. That was an external shock, and it's external in the sense that it had nothing to do with the country's government necessarily. It came from external factors. During the COVID pandemic, we saw a drastic decrease in tourism all across the globe. In some places, it was almost non-existent. For example, Thailand literally closed its borders. And so I did travel a lot during the COVID pandemic, but there were places I could not enter. Thailand was one of them. This is going to allow communities to be nimble. They are diversifying their activities, and that is going to benefit communities. Diversification means less impact when there is some kind of external shock like during the pandemic. Also, we want to remember that tourism can benefit a household, not just the person who's employed. Of course, people that are employed in tourism might have higher incomes because there's opportunities that didn't exist before, or there might be better opportunities with better pay. But we want to remember that those financial benefits, they trickle down to others. It's estimated that for each person employed in tourism, that wage that is created will create benefits for entire families. It's not something that's just retained by the person who earns the money. And sometimes, especially in the developed world, we're talking about extended family. Research says that this could be 4 to 10 people who are getting the indirect benefits from somebody's wage-related activity in tourism. Next, let's think about the benefits from cultural exchange. We know that travel creates awareness, right? It creates an appreciation for the differences between people. We know that travel breeds tolerance, it breeds understanding, it breeds acceptance, right? Something we need a lot more of in the world. But it may also help to preserve a culture. And I have great examples from indigenous cultures because I've been into many indigenous communities. We know that tribes open up to tourism, and we see this in Costa Rica, we see this in the Amazon, and I'm not saying all tribes, but there are some who have chosen to open up. And these are areas where opportunities are generally very limited. They often have high poverty rates. So you can imagine the economic boon that you're going to see when we have tourism opportunities to enter an indigenous community. And then think about the cultural exchange that takes place. It's something pretty amazing. It refers to one of their initiatives. This is the beginning of the Tourism Opens Minds Initiative. So that's the name of the initiative, Tourism Opens Minds. And then it says where it goes depends on you. So I love that. We also know that tourism can lead to preservation of locations, maybe locations that wouldn't be otherwise preserved. Maybe these are locations of cultural or historical significance. When we visit them as tourists, we're paying admissions fees. That collects funds, it generates revenue, and these funds can be invested. Buildings can be restored. And that means they're going to be there for the future enjoyment by locals as well as by tourists. So preservation efforts can come out of tourism. What we have here is a lot of benefits. So on the upside of tourism, we've got jobs, we've got tax revenue, we've got consumer spending, we've talked about cultural exchange, we've talked about preservation. And there may be other things we haven't even gotten on this list. The benefits from tourism can be quite large. However, it is important for us to realize that there can be a trade-off. It is not all a panacea. It's not all good without the bad. There are indeed downsides of tourism. So let's move on to talk about some of those downsides. Well, one downside is directly for the environment. There are more people, and those people are often in environmentally sensitive areas. For example, my groups that go to the Amazon jungle, because now tourists have found the Amazon jungle and they're going in greater numbers. There are more vehicles traveling around a country, means more pollution, air and water. There's more municipal waste, and I'm talking about garbage because tourists create a lot of garbage. More stress on the natural environment, and that is clearly a downside. This is going to affect habitats, it's going to affect sensitive ecosystems, it has an impact on wildlife. Add to that the need for infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is going to be those things like transportation networks. So think about your airports that need to be built, the trains you're going to develop, roads you're going to build. If you're going to have tourists, you need to have some transportation networks. But you're also going to need to build more hotels, and you're going to need to build and develop tourist attractions. And that means you're going to need to erect more power lines and expand your power grids. And all of these things displace nature to some level. And it could be that you have overinvestment in infrastructure at the expense of the natural environment. Now, let's be clear. Investment in infrastructure can be a good thing, and I'm not trying to say we don't want investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure is important for economic growth. A country needs to invest in these kinds of things, roads, communications, networks, power, but investments will not always be evenly distributed. You can think about a country. They are not going to flow everywhere. They might be very localized or focused on those touristic areas. That means they're not going to reach those people in rural areas. So I'm not saying investment in infrastructure is bad, but you might have too much of it, and it's not going to be evenly distributed. The other thing, though, is it might divert economic activity from one area to another based on where those infrastructure investments are made. And I've got a great example of this. So let's look at an example from the famous Inca ruins of Machu Picchu. This is in Peru. If you ever go to Peru, most likely this is one of your destinations. I have not been there yet. A new airport has been proposed near Machu Picchu. It's going to be in a nearby agriculture town. And as I write this, they've pushed the dates back a little bit. So as I record this in 2023, they're talking about 2025. We'll see how it goes. But the goal here is to increase tourism, right? It's an investment in infrastructure that is definitely directed at tourists because they want to make it easier for tourists to get there. That means more tourism, which is going to have some downsides to the environment. But we have to think about what is the impact on the environment. That's going to be important. And not just from more tourists, but think about having the airport itself. But another important concern is that it will divert people from the famous town of Cusco. Now, Cusco is kind of in the other direction. And there are some people that think, well, now Cusco's not going to get as much visitation. And if Cusco doesn't get as much visitation, that's going to change the economic impact on Cusco as some of this economic activity is diverted in the direction of the airport. Regardless, there's going to be changes in the economic impact from this. There will be some diverting of economic impact from one area to another, but we have to think about all of those other impacts that we've just talked about. So this is a big capital investment, but is it a good one? Is it the right decision? Of course, you can imagine this is being hotly contested for all of the reasons we've just talked about. Another downside of tourism is that tourists do not always respect the culture of the people in the country to which they are traveling. It might be that they're just uninformed, but here's the thing. Tourists don't have to choose to be uninformed. It can be solved with just a little research. So tourists that are uninformed, in my opinion, are choosing to be uninformed. And often they just don't care. Respecting the culture is not a priority for them. For example, you're going to see people dressed inappropriately. You're going to see people taking pictures of locals without having permission. And you always want to ask permission. And most of the time they'll say yes, but they should have the right to say no. And they're not respecting acceptable practices. Maybe things like removing shoes before entering a Thai temple or into a private home. You get the idea. So tourists may not be respectful of the culture in which they're visiting. And I have great examples of this from my travels to Thailand. If you visit Thailand, you've got to know that it's a very modest place. You've got to be dressed appropriately. And on the left is the sign that we walk past at beautiful Erawan waterfall. Now this makes it more than clear what the expectations for dress are, and it is to be very modest. This is not a place that's visited only by tourists. Locals go there with their families to have picnics and spend the day. Yet the picture on the right is all too common, and to be honest, based on what we saw on my last trip to Thailand, these are actually pretty modest bikinis compared to the very inappropriate bikinis we saw. But even though these bathing suits on the right would be perfectly acceptable in the United States, this country has communicated expectations and these tourists are just choosing to ignore it. For that reason, some places try to communicate expectations. One year, my Thailand group was going to Qatar. And this is the kind of thing you see in Qatar. They are trying to be very clear. When you're in Qatar, you are one of us. So help us preserve our culture and our values. Please dress modestly in public places. And then they tell you what that means. But again, people are going to ignore it. In Thailand, there would be certain cultural expectations that would be really big no-nos. For example, if you visit a Thai temple, you will never point your feet at the Buddha. It's a sign of disrespect because in Thailand, they think feet are really, really yucky. So that would be the kind of thing you would want to know before traveling. And a little bit of reading, it's not hard to figure these things out. In addition to disrespecting the culture, tourists don't always respect the rules and the laws in the country. Again, maybe because they're uninformed, but often it's just in pursuit of the best selfie, right? And they're disregarding anything else so that they can get that big selfie and post it on Instagram. And that's as if the rules don't apply to them. But obviously we need to remember when we're traveling, the rules do apply to us. So let me give you some examples, and there's so many of them. The first one talks about Russian tourists deported from Bali over half-naked photo on Sacred Mountain. I actually found a picture of this, and they were kind of half naked, laying on Sacred Mountain, taking their selfies. And below that, you've got 2 French tourists tried to take home 90 pounds of sand from the Italian island of Sardinia. On the right, a tourist was caught on video carving his initials into the Roman Colosseum. You have to wonder what has possessed these people. On the left, an American man visiting the former Auschwitz death camp in Poland was charged with attempting to steal a piece of the historic train tracks. And on the right, and I remember this, a group of teens pushed a rock off a crag at the top of this right here, a landmark that is millions of years old. And I do remember seeing that on the news. On the left, you've got an American tourist who was hospitalized after falling from a statue in Italy after drinking with his friends, so probably climbed up on that horse and wanted a selfie. And on the right, 2 tourists narrowly avoided up to 10 years in a Thai prison for spray painting a brick wall from the 13th century. Really, what in the world? But this one right here comes from Costa Rica. Selfie-crazed tourists prevent sea turtles from nesting. And this is Costa Rica. And you've got these turtles. This is an area I've been to before where the turtles come to nest and lay eggs. They should not have this many tourists this close to the turtles. This is really inappropriate. We also want to acknowledge that tourists create demand for questionable activities. And you'll see what I mean by questionable. Some activities are only likely to exist because of tourism. So we have created industries that maybe shouldn't be there. And without tourism dollars, these activities wouldn't be available. Here's an example from Thailand. We could have attractions that exploit animals, and this is the Tiger Temple in Thailand, and it's been shut down, but tourists could go, pay a pretty significant fee to visit, and take photos with tigers. And you can see why that might be exciting, right? How are you ever going to be that close to a tiger again? But there was concern over the care of tigers. Was there illegal breeding, trafficking, and were they being drugged? Now, again, nobody there was Thai in terms of tourists. These are all people like Americans, Europeans. This wouldn't exist without our tourism dollars. Another thing is that our tourism dollars unfortunately do things like support prostitution, which encourages human trafficking. And in Thailand, prostitution is accessible. It's very easy to find a prostitute if you want one. And then there's a related industry of sex tourism and sex shows. Again, there's a very seedy side of Thailand, and it's part of their culture. Again, we don't want to promote that. Tourism may also lead to cultural erosion. There could be a lot of Western influence that starts to change people's behavior and attitudes, and maybe locals are adapting to what they think tourists actually want. But either way, whether it's Western influence or them just adapting for the purpose of attracting tourists, this is cultural erosion. And so I have lots of examples of this from indigenous communities. In one indigenous community I was in Costa Rica, they were making dream catchers to sell to tourists. Now, dream catchers are not from their culture. This is something they were doing simply to attract additional dollars. It was definitely an erosion of culture. Why not instead try to sell things that are indigenous crafts that would be appropriate and from your tribe? I've also seen youth starting to wear Western clothing, and this is from my many years of travel to the same indigenous communities in Ecuador and the Amazon. So these are people that I know that have grown up, and then they start wanting to look different and wear makeup and have more Western careers and leaving the tribes. That's also a problem. Again, when youth are starting to wear Western clothing as opposed to their own indigenous clothing, where are they seeing this? They're seeing this from tourists. They may also see construction of facilities for tourists. I've seen them building things, but not in the typical indigenous manner. If you're going to build a hut for tourists, build it like the kind of hut you would stay in, rather than the kind of hut that maybe you think would attract tourists. So we're back to this balancing act. On the left, we've got our benefits. We've talked about jobs and tax revenue and consumer spending and cultural exchange and preservation. But on the right, we have costs. Tourism creates stress on the environment. We might have too much infrastructure as we build hotels and expand transportation networks just for tourists. There could be a lack of respect on the part of tourists, and there's no end to the examples that you can find there. And they also might violate laws. It could be ignorance. It could be just not caring. But then, of course, tourism dollars often support undesirable activities. The level of sex tourism is higher because of sex tourism, and that is money that's coming in from tourists who travel to certain destinations for the purpose of engaging in those activities. And then we've talked about cultural erosion. There are upsides and there are downsides. But the important thing at the end of the day is to maximize the benefits and minimize the costs as much as possible. That's the optimal thing. And the concept of ecotourism addresses these ideas, so we will be talking more about this idea of ecotourism with this in mind. But I want to leave you with this idea that everything that we've been talking about, maximizing the benefits, minimizing the costs, that ties into the idea of sustainable development. If you want to build a tourism sector, build a tourism sector, but build it in a way that maximizes benefits and minimizes costs. And then again, don't forget that you and your behavior as the tourist, as the traveler, also plays an important role. So guys, thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a fantastic day.